So shouts out to Kat McCritchie. She pointed me to Daniel Keel and his work, and this is some of these resources are from that. This, I'll let you all just kind of look at it and kind of read it, but of course you see the years from 54 to 61, Memphis City School enrollment, number of white students, number of black students. But of course, if you look in the far right column here, you'll see that Memphis is effectively continuing its segregated schools in the city. So we also may have heard of the Memphis 13, 1961, 13 elementary age kids, I believe they're all kindergarten or first graders, entered the school system in Memphis. What was interesting about the Memphis 13, which to give you context happened 6 years after Little Rock, the school district was very intentional about making sure that the integration process was very much so kept low key. They didn't want Southern segregationists to know. They didn't want to see what had happened in Little Rock with the kind of public vitriol and animosity toward what was happening, or any other of the Southern states that were taking place at the time. I mean, actually, JFK actually praises Memphis for peacefully integrating, and said that we were making the nation, United States, proud because of how it all went down, because of kind of the way it happened in Memphis. But still, this is a great point to kind of bring up that there's a difference between integration and desegregation. This here was this desegregated schools in Memphis, but it didn't truly integrate them. When you think about integration, we're thinking about the student body within the school being a significant number of Black children, so that there's a sense of them having power and a true stake in the school and the school culture and everything. So yes, Memphis kind of moved forward here, but and even in the years moving throughout the 60s, they integrated like a grade level pretty much every year moving forward, but still by the late 1960s, Memphis City Schools was the most racially segregated large school district in the US. Still, I pass the mic to Laura here.
Yeah, so this is another picture of the Memphis 13, or some of them. They're all in their 60s now. I believe all of them are actually still alive. There might be a few that have died, but a good chunk of them are still alive. And if you listen to any of their interviews, they talk a lot about the trauma that they went through in being the first Black to be in schools in Memphis. And so from there, in the late 60s, as Dex said, that they started to bring in some grades that were desegregated. There started to be some demands that Black families in Memphis wanted to present to the school board. Now that they have a stake in the larger school system, there were still needs that weren't being met. And so a group of parents, and by group I mean a lot of parents, started what became known as the Black Monday protests. This was in 1969, so almost it'll be 51 years ago this year. They presented a list of demands to the school board. It had a lot to do with in leadership, of talking about having more Black people represented in school leadership so that they would have, it would be more balanced. They talked about curriculum to be able to have more African-American history class offerings in textbooks that were more representative of the population in the school. They talked about let's see what else was there. They talked about wanting to have a more comprehensive desegregation program with Memphis schools, because like at this point, like Dex was saying, it was very, very gradual. but they wanted to speed up things. And once the school board kind of gave and they also talked about having more Black members on the school board. And when they were met with just kind of like shrugged shoulders, a group of thousands and thousands of parents decided that they would take their, every Monday, that they would take their children out of school and keep them at home. And why they did that was really interesting because at the time and still today, funding for schools is a lot based on enrollment and attendance. And so if thousands of parents are keeping their kids home, that's hitting the school district in the pocketbook. And as we know, a lot of times that creates a lot of pressure. And so at one point during the protest, there were 67,000 students who did not attend school at the height of this protest. And in the next few months, they ended up getting pretty much all of their demands. Now, there's some things that have kind of slipped away since then. And I'm actually going to drop a link to a story that I did in December about this, because it is like my absolute favorite story, Memphis history story. And Emily, that's the Black Monday protests. And it was accompanied by some marches at the time, but the main thrust of the protest was keeping students home. So would encourage y'all to learn more about that. It's very fun. You can take the next part, Dex. Yeah.
So yeah, so by 1970, just kind of pie chart shows the demographics of the school system in 1970. 16.4% of all the schools of the schools in Memphis were all Black, 12.2 were all white, and then greater than 90% white. Those were about 35% of the schools. So, we have 90% all white, 90% plus all white schools, or 34%, and then we have 90%, greater than 90% of the schools being Black, or about 33%. So the blue slither represents the schools in 1970 that were integrated. So we see that it's been 16 years since Brown v. Board, and this is where Memphis is at this time when it comes to school desegregation. All right, so, and some of you may be familiar with this image of the infamous buried bus. And as a response to one of the responses to try to ensure integration was happening was busing, and there was pushback for this idea in Memphis. It caused a lot of uproar. There was a lot of, essentially not wanting for this to happen. And you see one demonstration out in Fraser where a bus was buried. And then, of course, protesters are marching as well for the busing at Grandwood. And we see the city respond in a lot of different ways. And there was both Black community and white community, and to a certain degree, some were kind of hesitant of this busing idea. But one of the interesting things that took place was we see a lot of private schools kind of opening up during this era of post Brown v. Board. Some intention, right after busing took place, were founded. We did want to drop a question in the chat box, just kind of asking what private schools around today do you think kind of were birthed during this movement, or that you researched this already? So.
Yeah, and specifically to expand on that, these private schools, some very explicitly, some not as explicitly, but still, their actions spoke for themselves. It was in response to this push to integration. They said, well, if you're going to do that, we don't want our kids in public schools. We're going to put them in private schools. And to meet that demand, dozens and dozens of private schools opened up in Memphis. At one point, I want to say it was about 35,000 white students fled the public school system and either, mostly went to private schools. So yeah, any guesses on any schools that are still around from this era?
ECS, Christian Brothers, Briarcrest, Harding, St. Agnes, St. Dominic.
Interestingly, a lot of the Catholic schools were founded years and years before this, and some at the time even took it a step further to say, hey, white families, if you're trying to come to us because you don't want integration, don't think that will be a welcome place for you. I thought that was really interesting, looking through some really old articles about that. They, not only were they not a part of it, but they took a stand and said, we're not going to be your scapegoat for this reason.
So just a few to name, Briarcrest actually was founded in 1973. They started 13 schools across the city, kind of in direct response to busing. And then ECS started FACS started in February 1972. Lambton Lighter Montessori started around 72, 73. And then we have ECS starting in 65, St. George's starting in 1959, all kind of during this era.
So fast forwarding several decades, we, Memphis schools still were not integrated in a really meaningful way. And there was a lot of funding disparities because of that. Kind of what we talked about earlier, when it comes to redlining and housing discrimination, that's connected to schooling because a lot of students are assigned to their school based on their neighborhood. And so if you're already in an area that was, kind of deemed all Black from a long time ago or deemed all white from a long time ago, it's hard to break out of that mold and move on to, move up the social ladder to be able to afford something in another neighborhood. And schools are funded mostly by property taxes, and that obviously comes from the housing stock that you might have in the city or the county or the neighborhood. And so, let's see, this would have been just around 10 years ago. There had been for years talk about, there was Memphis City Schools, which was, obviously in the city. Shelby County Schools was made up of the suburban schools in the county. And for a long time, there were some people in the county who talked about, well, we would like to have our county tax dollars from our property taxes. If those property taxes are raised here, we want them to stay here and to be put into our schools. At that point, both the city and county property taxes went into the same pot and was divvied out based on student enrollment. But the proposal or the idea was for the county's property tax dollars to stay there and the cities to stay in the city. And that would have been devastating for the city school system because, as you all know, there's more expensive housing in the county. And so there would be, I think it was around maybe 40% of the tax dollars would have been from the county. And obviously the county makes up a much smaller portion than the whole city inside the county. And so there was a move in 2010 as that would have been a mid-year or a midterm election when Tennessee's state house majority changed from Democrat to Republican. And in that time, a lot of the Republican leadership was in favor of allowing the county to go through with this idea. And because at the time the law just wouldn't allow it. And so people at the city school level decided, well, if that's going to happen, what can we do to prevent that from happening? And the answer that they came up with was, let's merge the city and the county system, because that way all the tax dollars go into the same pot still. And so that happened in 2010. And there was a lot of controversy around it, because even people in the city, were talking about, we need to keep our own autonomy. We want to run our city schools the way that we want to. We don't want to have input from the county, because it's just have different needs and different strategies. And there was a lot of same argument on the county side as well. And so there was just a lot of debate back and forth of what should be done, and came to the point where there was a lot of planning to put them together. They were together for 1 year in 2013. And from there, you see this photo. This is a group of parents and kids who wanted to, now that the school system is together, said, well, maybe we can still come up with a law so that we can have our own suburban school districts. And so at this point, there still had to be a lot of moving pieces for the law to change for that to happen. And within quick succession, there was a whole bunch of lawsuits trying to block it, trying to make it happen. And in the end, we have what we have now, which is 6 suburban districts. On the outside, we've got Millington, Arlington, Bartlett, Collierville, Germantown, Lakeland, and then Shelby County Schools is the rest. So that's all of Memphis plus the unincorporated parts of the county. And as you can see from this graph, a lot of what we saw back in the 70s, as far as the makeup of the schools racially, who, what schools were 90% more Black or not, there's a higher percentage in 2017, and now it's the same, than there was a percentage in 1971. And the difference is that in 1971, those numbers were an impetus for a big integration plan, or at least a judge saying, because of these numbers, this doesn't reflect what the court had in mind for Brown versus Board of Education. Something needs to happen. But today, those same numbers do not, prompt the same kind of reaction.
Yeah, and what's interesting about what Laura is saying is, right, we see this mass exodus in the 70s once busing happens of white students, whether that is just to private schools and out of the district. And then we see kind of the exact same thing happening with the merger demerger, and the intent being to ensure that certain public dollars are only going to a certain population of students, which are predominantly white, due to, of course, connecting it back to housing discrimination and redlining and like the creation of the suburbs and like the majority of the population that's living out there. And even when we look in at the optional schools in Memphis, they were created right after busing happened, intentionally trying to preserve and keep a solid base of the white parents and students. And even today, we see, of course, still magnet programs are implemented in the district, understandably so. It's trying to hold on to that specific demographic of the city, because history tells us if true integration were to happen, again, there will be a lot of pushback, and essentially creating kind of where we are today even worse, potentially. So I think it's also important to understand that education started as a socialist institution that intended to provide all kids with equal education, right? It wasn't intended kind of like how it is today, where it's like some people as Nicole Hannah-Jones put it, some people get the Cadillac, others get the Pinto, right? Some people have this option of leaving their neighborhood or in being able to, access certain higher quality education if you're Black or brown based upon your performance, based upon, this sense of this is your ticket out. And they're often welcomed with open arms in a lot of more affluent schools, in private schools, whether that's, and of course in the private schools, you see a lot oftentimes with athletes historically being kind of accepted from Black and brown communities. But of course, like, if public education is intended to ensure that all kids get a equal quality education, right now we are not kind of in that space, if we're being honest, as far as what it's offering. And a lot of the capitalistic elements that exist in our society have infused into education. We see that with school choice and voucher programs, and like the inherent belief is, yeah, there are going to be some schools that are good and some schools that are not, right? And we've accepted that as a society, unfortunately, and a lot of us, oftentimes we haven't realized we've accepted that, there are going to be separate but equal schools in the U.S., right? And that's just the reality of it. I mean, there are going to be separate schools as long as they're equal, even though we know they're not equal, using the same language of, Plessy v. Ferguson. The whole Hannah-Jones also says that the inequality is systemic, but it's also upheld by individual choices, right? If you don't know the context of Nicole Hannah-Jones, she's doing some amazing work on this front. She has a book that she's working on titled The Burden We All Live With, I believe. Let me make sure I get the title right. I believe it's The Burden We All Live With. And she's kind of on the forefront of really helping America realize that our schools are very segregated today. All right. And I think it's something we all know, but we've all kind of like inherently accepted. And even, so let me actually back up. Nicole Hannah-Jones, she's a, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. She's the author of the 1619 Project. And she, and living in New York, has intentionally taken her child to a predominantly Black and brown school in New York that's 95% free and reduced lunch, right? And a lot of her belief in ideologies and like the reasoning why, believing that her child doesn't inherently deserve a better education than another child. And if this is okay for this child, then it's okay for it's just okay for her child. And her push is for parents to realize that, and let me preface this, I say this is not being a parent right now and knowing the difficulties of decision, but the push is for parents to realize that if we are participating in the system of this racially segregated society when it comes to schooling, we are enabling the system, we are upholding the system, essentially. And just trying to get people to rethink their choices and how those choices are, reinforcing kind of the inequity in our society. She also says the integration ties the fate of Black children and white children together. And that is how Black and brown children end up getting equal education, right? Thurgood Marshall, the individuals who worked on Brown v. Board, didn't think that, Black children would magically learn better and become smarter because they sat next to white kids in school. They knew that there were certain things that were going to be that weren't going to be accepted because they were in school with white children, right? Thinking back to my time at Kingsbury, like if Kingsbury was more so had a population that wasn't predominantly Hispanic and African American, there are certain things at that school that just would not be allowed. And we see this with neighborhoods and with the process of gentrification and how that's taking place, and how neighborhoods end up getting speed bumps down the street. Neighborhoods end up getting bike lanes, whatever, right? Because of the social capital, because of the influence that comes with that.
Okay, and so part of what makes this really interesting, putting Memphis in a national context of what happens in how schools are set up, the process of how we determine resources and where they go. The example of the merger and demerger that happened here is one of many examples in the U.S. And there's a report, a national report that this map is from an organization called EdBuild. What they term it as calling it district secession, where there are times where a larger county system wants to break off into smaller pieces so that those tax dollars, those resources can be more segregated. They don't go into that same pot and then, are distributed equally. It really just ends up being based on if your little section of the county has enough tax dollars, then you'll get that amount of resources, and that they're not shared within even the same county. And a lot of what helped early on in the places in the South where integration was more possible was because they had these bigger county systems. You go into the North and there's these tiny, I remember meeting a reporter who covered, I think it was around 40 districts within one county somewhere in Pennsylvania. And part of what made the efforts that did work in integration in the South was because of this kind of bigger pot of money that they all shared together. And each of these dots represents a place in the past maybe 5-10 years where state laws have allowed districts to break up again. And this national report cited Shelby County here in Memphis as one of the most egregious examples in how Tennessee's law was one of the most permissive in the US to allow this to happen. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, so this is our part on the past. It's a lot. What questions do you guys have? So we've got one question so far. One thing that that you're mentioning in your question that kind of harkens back to what we talked about last time of how city and county government works and what money goes where. We noted then that the city of Memphis does not contribute money to the public schools in Memphis. And that came as a result of the merger and demerger. When the city and county systems merged, the city of Memphis chose to say, well, if this is going to be a county system now, then we argue that we don't have the responsibility to put city tax dollars into this system anymore. And so that's been the case ever since 2013, and that hasn't changed. So that's an example for y'all to consider.
How common is that? How common is that in other systems in the country? Do you know?
In the country, I don't know. I would wager to say it's pretty rare. So for example, even in this county, part of what made the demerger possible was that the town of Collierville, the city of Germantown, city of Bartlett, all these municipalities within our county said, okay, we will step up because we want to have our own school systems apart from the big county system. We will raise our property tax. We will raise our whatever tax to kind of help fill in the gaps to meet the standard of education that we want to have for our kids. And that is not the case in Memphis. It was the exact opposite. So that's an example there. And Sydney, that's a good question. Yes. But this is more, I guess, based on a state level, maybe not a city level. There are some states that are considering ways to basically make a budget formula that's not entirely based just on student enrollment, but more, say, if you have a student who comes from a family living in poverty and you have a student who doesn't, they're going to allocate more money per student for the student living in poverty than they would for the other student. So it's trying to create a system of how do we allocate money based on need rather than just seeing every student as needing the exact same amount of money. So for example, another example would be English language learners, students who don't know English as their first language and they're learning as they're in school. They need more services, so therefore they need more money. So the state may say, for these students, we will allocate a little bit more money per student and kind of reshuffle how we dole out money that way.
All right. Did y'all see these other two questions from Sarah and Sydney's second question?
What is it? I'm looking at it now. What is?
So Sarah asked, what is the reasoning for tying school funding to property taxes? And why does the city and county revenue not just go all into one bucket and then get divvied out to the various programs? Which is a very logical question and thought.
I wouldn't be able to tell you the origin story of property taxes and why that's been tied so much to funding, but that is how it's been for a very long time, and kind of is part of that same thread of if we can separate people by housing and who we want to have in certain places, then we can concentrate resources in different places. It kind of goes along that same line of reasoning. Just fine line of reasoning, but that's what it is.
And along that, just thinking of like the reason for the merger, demerger, and a lot of that was tied to communities wanting their money to go to their communities, their kids. And one of the kind of things to think about is like with the intent of public education, and like it would make sense for it to go into one bucket and be divvied up to the public. But we kind of see a system in place where it's like some schools are able to have private school education on the public dime, essentially. And there is, for example, like some schools PTAs raise thousands of dollars like that, right? Others, $2,000 raised through the PTA is a good year, right? And thinking about what that does and what that provides to students in certain schools, and even thinking from the athletic perspective, I coached at football at Kingsbury for 5 years, and we intentionally had to schedule games against MUS and some of the larger schools, and they would pay us $2,000-$3,000 to play an away game at their stadium, right? And that money from looking at the football budget was used for us to even buy buses to get to games. So like there's just so much disparity, not just of course academically, but just the whole experience for the student because of like these things. And now, different communities have different access to resources.
Yeah, Dex, if I can jump in for a second, I worked for 5 years for an elementary school fundraising company. And my whole introduction to Memphis was our company got here right after the demerger right after the systems merged. And then I was leaving the company right around the time that all the municipalities jumped out. But we were able to predict within $100 how much money we were going to raise at every single school by looking at the percentage of free and reduced lunch students at the school, because you could estimate what parents would give based off of that number, which is wild. And I was texting Emily a second ago in response to a question she had, and we were saying that is the whole reason that we use the word socialist about how the system was set up. If you are going to have publicly funded schools that are set up for the entire city, like it is imperative that they all have exactly the same resources offered, so that no kid in the city is up a creek just because they were born into a different school district than another one. And instead, we have what we say are leveled school systems. But your example is like of the Kingsbury fundraising stuff is wild. Like, just as an example, like, I won't name the school, but there is a public school in Shelby County Schools. When I first got here, we did a 2-week fundraiser there, and it's a K-8 school, kind of similar numbers to Kingsbury. We raised $65,000 in 2 weeks, and it was purely like result of where the school was situated, but also like the school itself had so many more outlets for programs and all that kind of stuff. And then that just piled on top of all of that. So it's a wild disparity.
Mm.
About how many public schools do you think there are in Memphis? Just a stab. We got 200, 100. What else we got? Y'all feeling pretty good about that? Okay. All right. So 101. Thank you, Darius. So if you can move on to the next chart, we'll go through the different types of schools that are in Memphis. There's a lot of different types. When it comes to public schools, there are 254. It's a lot. And this has more than just the public schools. It includes also the private schools, 90 private schools, as you can see. So I'm just going to go through just these kind of types of schools, just to give you a very broad picture of how complex the Memphis education landscape is here in Memphis. So this big purple band that you see, the 167, those are traditional schools. Now that they are part of Shelby County Schools, which is the main school system here in Memphis. And they make up obviously the bulk of schools, and it would be very similar to just kind of how you think of schools maybe when you were growing up. This blue band, the 57 SES charter schools is what that is in the legend. In 2002, the Tennessee state legislature passed a law allowing for schools to be created where they have a little bit more autonomy than a traditional public school. Traditional public school, they have to go through, the district sets what the curriculum is, the district sets how you hire, and all these very things that are meant to be uniform throughout the district. That's why it's a district, it's a system of schools. But through this law, charter schools are able to have a lot more autonomy on things like curriculum and hiring, and don't necessarily have to follow what the district says. And the point of that is to be able to create more innovation on a smaller scale. There's a lot of the charter schools here are single site schools. It's just one school per organization that runs the school. But then there are several networks of schools that have, anywhere from 2 to 10. I want to say the largest one has about 10 schools within their system. And the point is to be able to, just have more innovation. And with that freedom also comes with a higher standard of accountability and saying, okay, we've given you more freedom, and so you need to show us results. But they are under the umbrella of Shelby County Schools. The next band, that 34, the yellow one, municipal schools, that goes back to what we were talking about with the demerger when the county split into 6 suburban districts. So they're represented there. The next band, the 29 ASD schools, the ASD, that stands for Achievement School District. The ASD is run by the state of Tennessee. In 2010, I want to say, Tennessee participated in what is known as Race to the Top. It was a federal kind of competition, I guess you could say, for grants to be able for states to come up with their own system of how to hold districts accountable and improve student test scores. And what Tennessee came up with, and several other states, was to have this kind of last resort district where if the local district wasn't serving students well and they had really, really low test scores, that the state could come in and take over the school and run it their way in what they saw, or they saw fit to improve the school. And so in 2012, the first schools were taken over by the state, and it had a huge ripple effect on neighborhoods that felt that they were losing their identity in their school and that sort of thing. But also at the same time, the state's argument was, well, where it was right there was not where it should be, and the point is to improve them. And now, 8 years later, the state has basically abandoned the current iteration of what the ASD is. A lot of the test scores remained low. There were some bright spots where there were schools that improved, but it became very clear through the research that happened over at Vanderbilt and other research saying that just by changing management didn't mean that test scores were going to improve. There's a lot more that goes into it than just changing of hands. And so the state is still using this model as kind of like a really last resort, but it is going to be much more hampered going forward. So that's in a nutshell what's happened in the last 8 years with the ASD. And then of course this next band, the 90, is the private schools in Memphis. And then this one lonely school, the one that's labeled TN SBOE charter schools, came from a fight, for lack of a better word, between Shelby County Schools and a charter school network here in Memphis. They had applied, they had been operating under the state for a few years, and they wanted to be able to apply and open up a school under Shelby County Schools, the local school district. The school district looked at their application, said, no, we don't think you're doing well under the state, so we don't think that you should open one under us. And the school board voted against it. They appealed to the state. The state reviewed their application and said, actually, we think you should open a school in Memphis under the district. The district still said no. And so now the State Board of Education runs this one school in Memphis. And yeah, so that's an overview of just the many complexities of that. So, and then I see a question here, what are Montessori schools under? So of the 2 public Montessori schools that I know of, most of them are private, so they would be under that 90 band. But of the 2 private schools I know of that, or public schools, excuse me, that operate under that Montessori model. One is under the ASD in Fraser, and the other is under Shelby County Schools, and I honestly forget the name of it. I'm sorry, but it's somewhere up in North Memphis.
It's Veritas, isn't it? Isn't that the one in Fraser? Libertas, that's right.
Libertas, yes. Yeah.
Libertas.
And the one school for under the state board, Darius, is Bluff City. It's under Green Dot Public Schools. That's the name of it. Okay, so moving on to how the largest school district in our county is run. On the left, you've got our school board. It's made up of 9 members. Anyone know any names off the top of their head that they want to put in the chat? There we go. I got Stephanie Love. Yeah, she's bottom right here. The Reverend Althea Green. Yes, Miska, she's at the top on the left. She is the current school board chairwoman. Yes, and Kevin Woods, he's right under Althea Green there on the bottom left. And anyone know the name of our current superintendent? He's on the right here. Yes, Joris Ray. He was appointed a little over a year ago now by the school board. Basically, how that works is each of the school board members are elected by their districts, and they have one employee, and that employee is the superintendent. They appoint him or her, and they evaluate that person, they manage them, and basically guide kind of the what of what the district does. They set the vision and saying this is what we expect, and the superintendent's job is to carry that out.
This next segment is going to be just a quick rapid fire over and under. We're going to kind of get into the big issues kind of facing education. And one of the large initiatives that the district is putting on the forefront, titled Our Boys Need Us initiative, and it's centered around the black men and black boys in the district. So just type in the chat box over under based on the prompt. So first one, over under. African American males living in poverty in Memphis. Is it over or under 60%? Over, you are correct. 66%. All right. Over under, in comparison with all other students in the district, African American males are blank percentage more likely to be enrolled in special education. Over or under 60%? That one's actually under. It was right at 50%. Emily got that correct? Okay. Yes, and if you do some more further research on the starting of special education, a lot of that legislation was put in place and was disproportionately categorizing Black students, specifically Black male students as well, into special ed courses when they most likely didn't need that. All right, over under. Excuse me. African American males enrolled in AP courses. You think it's over or under 9%? I'm sorry to crush your hope, Tamara, but it is 5% currently enrolled in AP courses. And we'll get into this on the next slide, kind of some of the reasoning why behind that. This is in the district. This is district data. All this is district data. Sorry, I could have said that. This is from the, I linked the report in the PowerPoint from the Our Boys Need Us report that the district put out. All right, over under, in comparison with all the students in the district, African American males are blank percent less likely to be enrolled in CLU. Over or under 40% here?
And just for some context, CLU is a gifted education program. So kind of like an honors. I don't know what you guys would have been familiar with when you guys were coming up, but a gifted education program. Over
is correct. 50% less likely to be enrolled in CLU than other students. So one of the, Dr. Lowe, he is the head of the equity branch at Shelby County Schools. It's a new branch. They they're pushing this initiative called the Equity Champions, and to where every school has to have 2 representatives in the school who kind of represent the district, and trying to teach teachers, admin, anyone kind of on bias training. And he said that they have identified like 200 or 300 boys to be recognized as being in CLUE. Oftentimes, unfortunately, a lot of young, gifted young Black boys are deemed, and some of the bias comes from the teachers, and them seeing that, oh, because they might have behavior problems or might not behave in the way that they that align with the status quo of how, people should behave. And we all know that boys in school typically are deemed for behavior more so, but more so for Black boys, they were not recommended to even be included when they should have, based on the data, based on their scores. Over and under, in comparison with all other students in the district. Oh, I forgot to put a percentage on this one. You guys get a pass. Expelled or suspended. Y'all just guess the percentage for this one. What do you think? The suspension is 50% more likely to be expelled or suspended from school. And again, a lot of this goes into implicit bias. There's a lot of research on implicit bias in teachers, not just white teachers, but Black teachers too, on Black boys and their behaviors they see in class, and them attributed them to being disruptive, whether that's getting kicked out, suspended, all these type of things. And the data shows that. So.
Yeah, and a lot of how that research is done is showing, if 2 students have the same infraction, one is white, one is Black, what is the punishment that they get? Is it, the same? Is it one more harsher than the other? So that's what a lot of the research goes into.
Yeah. And I know Shelby County Schools is implementing a lot of progressive discipline kind of things within the system. So to try to cut back on these numbers. All right. Some of the other big issues, of course, like funding. We know that lower poverty schools get Title I funds. There's also special designated funds for certain populations in building, whether that be SPED, English language learners. They get federal funding. Of course, they're still getting state funding as well. But the other funding that comes to schools comes from fundraising, PTA, kind of like I mentioned earlier. But one of the kind of values that comes with when it comes to issues in education too is just the social capital piece, and having access to knowing people who can write recommendations for XYZ jobs, all these different type of things that come with that, things that all of us want for our children, but in the reality of our educational atmosphere that society has created, a lot of kids don't have that access. Yes, there are kids who live in Binghamton or Orange Mound that can apply for White Station or apply for these different schools, but the masses of those kids, the masses of those families can't afford to either drive their kids to these schools or do that. They got to go to the neighborhood school. So why not make sure the neighborhood school is equitable? Of course, we got literacy being an issue on all levels, and that's been pushed by the district in Shelby County Schools anyway. Implicit bias, kind of what I just spoke of, the equity champions piece. Teacher turnover. There's a lot of different reasons that are causing teacher turnover. One, just being a teacher, teaching is like grueling and it's hard and it's tiring. But part of it is kind of a lot of teachers, they say that the reason they get out of teaching is because of not being able to kind of ascend in the career. And as a teacher, right? Yes, you can try to go into admin, but why can't you ascend as a teacher in a way that is honoring the work you put in, honoring degrees that you have, all those things. So, and then one thing we also wanted to discuss was like supporting students amid the COVID crisis and kind of the questions that are coming up amongst this time. we know the district has put out the kind of implementation plan as far as going back to school, giving parents choice. But of course, you got to think about access to technology. Laura brought this up to me the other day too, just how MLGNW is starting to require, their bills to be like, they're kind of requesting bills, and rent and mortgages are starting to become due when they were put on hold, of course, due to COVID. What that's going to do, online learning might not be able to happen in your house if the lights are off. So kind of how they are right now. Let me cut the light on after I talk. But so thinking about like supporting students amidst COVID, and the district is trying to implement a one-to-one district. They were just talking about the laptops and how they're going to be rolled out in the town hall, just like at 6 o'clock tonight. But a lot of the questions that have come up for the teacher's perspective is, what type of procedures are being put in place? Are teachers going to be given hazard pay? Are teachers going to be provided some sort of, if a teacher catches COVID, are they gonna have to use their sick days? Like what kind, like all these different things. What happens if a teacher catches it? All those kids got to quarantine for 14 days, 150 plus kids. So like all these questions are being brought up, and the district is kind of considering them moving forward.
I think you hit it, especially like when talking about how education is so much tied to every other system in the city. The MLGNW is starting to disconnect starting August 3rd is a big one, and talking about like, at this point, schools have tried to, provide laptops and not just laptops, but also hotspots so they can connect to the internet if they don't have internet access. But all of that work goes down the drain if their lights are cut off. Or, eviction hearings have started back up, where those were paused, like Dex said. And so if you end up getting evicted, then you have nowhere to do your online learning, or at least nowhere stable. I'll give a quick summary of each of these groups that are connected to education in some way. I'll start with the top left, 901. That is a teacher-led advocacy group. They work on various education issues. The one right next to it and below it, United Education Association and Memphis Selby County Education Association, they specifically represent teachers and other licensed educators as the closest that we have in Tennessee to unions. Unions don't have a whole lot of power in Tennessee when it comes to the public sector, but they do have the power to negotiate with their districts about pay, about working conditions, and that sort of thing. And then the far right, on the top, we've got Stand for Children. In the middle bottom, we've got Bridges, which is a student advocacy organization. Facing History and Ourselves, we mentioned during the last session. They work mostly with schools. And I'll go back to Bridges real quick. One of the recent initiatives that they have been working on since the last time that we all met, I'm going to drop a link in the chat, is about police in schools. Some students have gotten together to talk about the role of police in schools, and if they really need to be in schools, or if there's other ways that we can make schools safe. And then Dex, if you want to talk about Facing History and Ourselves while I look for this link.
Yeah, so Facing History, they have partner schools within a district that they go in and intentionally do identity trainings on race, trainings on equity. They rolled out a very detailed kind of training on how eugenics and standardized testing has impacted just the history of that and how that impacts school climate today. They partner with principals, and they'll come to your school and like do a training for your teachers if they're struggling with racial bias or whatever. And even if you're not a partner school, I'm sure you could call them up and like work something out. They love this stuff.
Okay, and we've got 2 more slides real quick, and then we'll open up for any other questions that people have. As we mentioned last time, election coming up August 6th, so exciting. So for school board this year, if you go to the next slide, the districts that are up for election, there's 5 of them. There's District 2 right here in the purple in the middle, District 3, which includes like Fraser and all up there. District 4, which is kind of split really odd. It's because in the white sections are where the suburban districts are, so that's not actually part of Shelby County Schools. And then District 5, which is also split, kind of funny. And District 7, did I count all of them? 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, yes. Actually this week, you're in luck. If you don't know who to vote for, there are 15 people who are running for these 5 seats, which is a lot. And this week, the organization I work for, Chalkbeat, we're hosting 2 forums, one on Thursday and one on Monday, for people to just hear from candidates and hear what they care about, what issues are important to them, and just hear their platforms really and have a good discussion. So yeah, that is it, guys. We made it through another session of information overload. What questions do you guys have?
Or one question as you guys are looking, and you know more about this, like being a reporter in the in this specific field, but like, what are the questions we should have of school board people? Like when we're trying to figure out what's most important, who's most qualified. I mean, that might be too biased of a question for you to answer, and if so, you can pass to Dex. But like, but are there things that you feel like we should pay attention to this person or that person's proficiency by looking at what they say about this or that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about like school board, it's not like if it was a superintendent that we were electing, I would want to know like, you know, his education history of like, you know, what his degrees were in, this, that, and the other. But school board is like a whole separate kind of entity because really they're representing their communities, and you really don't need a college degree to represent your community well. But you know, and you don't even always have to have, you know, the most nuanced you know, understanding of everything that goes on in the district, because every school board member that I've ever met, you know, before they were on school board, they were like, yeah, I thought I knew something. And then they got in the thick of it and we're just like, wow, this is super complicated and, you know, more involved than I ever would have thought. But I mean, the role of a school board is to represent their community and their community's interests with parents, students, teachers, and then other community leaders. So, I mean, that's from my, you know, thought process as a reporter, you know, that's kind of how I view like the role of the school board. And so I don't know if I have a true answer to like what qualifications to look for other than like, are they an advocate for their community well? And then do they fit your views on what education, you know, policies or things that you like to see?
Yeah. I think it's interesting too. So Reverend Althea Green, she is actually my school board representative, and she's the only person who was a former educator that's a school board member currently. Before her, and she's like 1 year on the job apparently. Like, and before her, there was like a 5-year period where there were no educators on the school board. So just thinking of, and understand school boards, you know, shouldn't just be exclusively educators, but you know, I think you should have some sort of knowledge of Memphis, the kids in Memphis, how the schools operate in Memphis, when making informed decisions about things things that impact kids, teachers in Memphis.
That's really interesting. Who else has questions? Any other questions before we kind of wrap up here? Okay, so time commitment for school board members, 4 years per term. Are there a limit on terms? That's one thing I just thought about.
Not that I know of. Kat can probably correct me if she's still on here, but I don't think they do. Chris has a good question, I think, for you, Dex, on some practical ways that people can support public schools.
I think, like, I know streets at Kingsbury is very like instrumental in like finding ways where you can mentor kids. I think kids are always looking for mentors, and volunteer in different capacities. I've had a streets employee at streets like just volunteer 2 times a week in my class where she would just come in and just assist, and it was like amazing because anytime human capital is like one of the biggest needs in schools. So that doing something of that sort, it can be after school tutoring. I don't know. I think a lot of it's just centered around support and just physically being, showing your face in schools, showing kids that, showing them that you love them in different ways. Huh?
Yeah, and I think from that place of being in schools and around teachers and students, it can fuel your knowledge of how to advocate more on a macro level. Like, that will help you kind of create your own ideas of like, this is what I want to see and how I can advocate for that in different capacities.
I know I'll kind of echo what Dex said about teacher supports. One thing that Elizabeth has tried to do in one of our kids' classrooms every year is to just go once a week and just, email with the teacher ahead of time and just figure out what is some busy work that she's got to do on the side or that he's got to do on the side that she can come and just do for them. So like if it's cutting stuff out for a bulletin board, or if it's not grading papers, obviously, but like if it's like organizing some stuff or making a bulletin board, or even just like, kind of being there for class celebrations or parties or, field days, whatever. And it's not rocket science. But presence is hugely important. And it'll look different this year with COVID. Like most schools will have no visitor policies this fall, at least. But something for us to think about as a young adult community might be figuring out how to invest in a few classrooms during the course of the year, and maybe have teams of folks that go and serve a classroom in whatever ways are practically possible for them. I know we got a bunch of teachers in our crew, and so that may be a really great way to serve as well. Okay, guys, this has been so helpful. Laura and Dex, thank y'all so much for the time you put into preparing this, and just your time into teaching all of us this. Like, this has been. I thought I knew a lot about this arena, and like I was proven wrong tonight. And so thank y'all so much for that. I don't know if there's going to be a part 3 or not. I'm sure we can figure out something we would want to learn from y'all more about in the future, but we're going to have some incredible FYA interview series episodes that are coming out soon that have been recorded and are being edited now, and that we'll do a similar thing to what we did for this. Like, we'll have an excerpt of that will play, and then we'll do some discussion and questions around those topics on a night Zoom call. But yeah, this has been Laura. This has been
sorry, I couldn't help it.
This has been really good, and I can't thank y'all enough. Make sure you're staying tuned in to Sundays at Fellowship and just kind of keeping connected that way. But thank y'all so much again for tonight, and we will see you soon.